You know what? We're going to hear about both tonight on the panel and throughout the whole show, the winners, the losers. My message to the losers, losers look in the mirror.
Bill Maher hasn't let up on his own party in over a year now, and it's not one rant. It's a sustained campaign delivered week after week, segment after segment, aimed at forcing Democrats to actually look at why they keep losing instead of blaming everyone but themselves. Here's the full arc of that argument from election night to now. Before we get into it, hit like and subscribe now. This channel breaks down exactly this kind of claim every week, and you don't want to miss the next one. Start at the beginning, because the tone was set the very night of the 2024 loss. Maher opened his show with a line that landed like a slap. Losers look in the mirror. He said it to a studio audience that had clearly expected comfort, not accountability, and when he got dead silence in response, he pushed further instead of backing off, asking if maybe they should try it anyway. He walked through how Democrats had spent months insisting the race wasn't really close, and then lost every single swing state. His point wasn't really about the loss itself. It was about the refusal, even in the immediate aftermath, to entertain the possibility that the party's own choices, not just Trump's advantages, had something to do with it. That theme, self-examination versus deflection, became the through line of basically everything Maher said about his own party over the following year. Months later, he zeroed in on a specific, small moment that he argued captured the bigger problem perfectly, an Academy Awards opening that featured a formal land acknowledgment thanking the indigenous peoples whose ancestral territory Hollywood now sits on. Maher's advice to Democrats was blunt. If you ever want to win an election again, the single most important first step is to stop doing exactly that. His point wasn't that the history being acknowledged wasn't real. It was that leading a major, mainstream, nationally televised event with that kind of ritual, aimed almost entirely at signaling values to an audience that already shares them, is exactly the kind of thing that reads as strange and off-putting to the much larger audience the party actually needs to win over. He picked up the same thread again around Thanksgiving, going after a state legislator who'd claimed she never actually wanted to cancel the holiday after previously making comments suggesting exactly that. Maher's reaction was pure disbelief. He told her flatly he didn't believe her. The specific dispute over that one lawmaker's position matters less than what it represented to Maher. A pattern of figures in this wing of the party, staking out genuinely fringe positions on deeply popular, uncontroversial American traditions, then walking them back or denying them entirely the moment the position became a political liability, rather than either owning it or never taking it in the first place. Then there's the ghost brand bit, which is maybe the sharpest single metaphor Maher's used all year. He compared the Democratic Party, sitting at its lowest approval rating in 35 years, to companies like Kodak or General Electric, brands that still technically exist but have become hollowed-out shells of what they once were because they drifted away from whatever made them successful in the first place. His read on how that happens to a political party was pointed. Democrats, in his telling, increasingly resemble an upscale boutique trying to impress a narrow, wealthy, culturally sophisticated audience, rather than a mass-market brand built to serve the broadest possible coalition of ordinary people. His closing line was characteristically blunt. Democrats need to get their act together, or the ghost brand becomes permanent. It's worth taking that comparison seriously as more than just a clever bit, because brand decline in business actually follows a fairly well-documented pattern that maps onto what Maher's describing in politics. A company doesn't lose its market position overnight, it loses it gradually, one small decision at a time, each of which seems individually defensible to the people making it. Chasing a more premium, higher-margin customer segment, updating the product to reflect what internal focus groups say they want, gradually shedding the mass-market customers who made the brand successful in the first place because they seem less sophisticated or less profitable than the new target audience. By the time the decline becomes undeniable in the sales numbers, the company has often spent years congratulating itself on exactly the choices that caused it. Maher's argument is that the Democratic Party's relationship with its traditional working-class base has followed almost exactly that same arc, a gradual drift toward a more educated, more affluent, more culturally particular coalition, each step of which felt like progress internally, while the broader customer base it used to depend on quietly drifted elsewhere. The most detailed version of this entire argument came together more recently when Maher moved from vibes and metaphors into an actual accounting exercise. He pointed to a group of House Democrats who'd tried to sign on to something called the Promise to America, a pledge that, stripped down, mostly just restated basic, broadly popular American values: support for a market economy, for public safety, for genuine pride in the country, rather than reflexive shame about it, positions that, in any other decade, wouldn't have needed a pledge at all, because they'd have been assumed baseline for anyone in either party. Out of 212 House Democrats, only about 13 signed it, with roughly 10 of those actually sitting in Congress. Maher's read on that number was blunt: there's an easier way to lose swing districts than refusing to put your name on sentences that basic. That number is really the concrete center of everything else Maher said this year, because it moves the argument from feeling to measurement. It's one thing to say a party seems too far removed from ordinary voters. It's another to point to an actual countable vote, a pledge nearly every member of the party's own caucus declined to sign. And note that the number declining wasn't a handful of outliers, it was the overwhelming majority. That's not a matter of interpretation, it's a head count. It's worth being specific about why a number like that matters more than a single controversial quote or viral clip, because it's harder to explain away as an isolated incident or a media distortion. A clip can be edited unfairly, a quote can be stripped of context, a single lawmaker's comment can be dismissed as one bad actor rather than representative of anything broader. A near-unanimous refusal by an entire congressional caucus to sign on to a handful of genuinely uncontroversial sentences doesn't have that same escape hatch. Either the sentences themselves were somehow objectionable, in which case Democrats owe voters a specific explanation of which parts they disagreed with, or the reluctance to sign had more to do with internal politics, discomfort with looking insufficiently progressive to primary voters and activist groups, than with any actual disagreement over the substance. Neither explanation reflects particularly well on the party's ability to project the kind of confident, mainstream identity Maher's been arguing it desperately needs. It's worth giving the fair pushback here because there's a real one. Plenty of members who didn't sign the pledge might have objected to specific wording rather than the underlying sentiment. A pledge is a blunt instrument, and declining to sign a specific document isn't the same as rejecting everything it gestures toward. Some Democrats have also pointed out that Maher's read of individual moments, the land acknowledgment, the Thanksgiving comment, cherry-picks small symbolic gestures rather than grappling with the party's actual policy platform, which polls considerably better on most individual issues than the party's overall brand does. That's a real distinction worth taking seriously. A party can have popular policies and an unpopular image at the same time, and fixing the symbolism doesn't automatically fix the substance or vice versa. But that distinction actually strengthens Maher's core point rather than undermining it. If the party's individual policies genuinely poll well in isolation, and plenty of the data on this backs that up, then the persistent unpopularity of the overall brand has to be explained by something else. Maher's answer, consistent across every one of these segments, is that the something else is exactly the symbolic layer critics want to wave away as trivial: the rituals, the language, the specific viral moments that become the party's public face, regardless of what the actual legislative agenda contains. Voters don't experience a party primarily through its committee votes. They experience it through the clips, the controversies, and the handful of representative moments that make it onto their feed. And Maher's argument, built patiently across more than a year of these segments, is that too many of those representative moments have been self-inflicted, avoidable, and disconnected from what most Americans, including plenty of persuadable Democrats, actually care about. Put the whole arc together: the election night reckoning nobody wanted to sit through, the land acknowledgement, the Thanksgiving denial, the ghost brand metaphor, and finally, the pledge nearly the entire caucus declined to sign. And it stops looking like a comedian picking easy targets for laughs. It looks like a full year of the same argument, tested against a new piece of evidence almost every month, without the underlying diagnosis ever really changing. Whether the party actually listens is a separate question from whether the diagnosis holds up, but by this point, it's had a lot of chances to be wrong, and it keeps finding new evidence instead. It's worth thinking through what it would actually look like for the party to take this critique seriously, because Maher himself has floated more constructive versions of it across these same segments, not just the criticism. He's talked about wanting a genuine mainstream figure who can bond with ordinary voters the way earlier generations of Democratic leaders once could, rather than someone who reads as fluent in the concerns of a narrow, highly educated coalition and disconnected from everyone else. He's floated the idea that the party needs its own version of the kind of media figure who can reach audiences well outside the traditional political media ecosystem, rather than only ever showing up on outlets and platforms where the audience already agrees. None of that requires abandoning the party's actual policy commitments. It requires separating the substance from the specific cultural signaling that's attached itself to that substance over the past several years, and being willing to let go of the signaling even while keeping the underlying policy goals intact. That's really the distinction worth carrying forward from this entire year of commentary. Maher isn't arguing Democrats should become Republicans or abandon concern for inequality, immigration, or civil rights. He's arguing that the specific cultural packaging wrapped around those concerns, the ritual, the vocabulary, the reflexive positions on symbolic questions that mean little to most voters but generate outsized backlash, has become a genuine electoral liability independent of the substance underneath it. Fixing the packaging without abandoning the substance is a harder, less satisfying task than either fully embracing the current approach or fully retreating from it. But it's the version of the argument Maher's actually been making, consistently, across more than a year of segments, and it's a considerably more nuanced position than either his fiercest critics or his most enthusiastic supporters usually give him credit for. It's worth ending on the practical test this whole argument is eventually going to face, because commentary like this only matters if it eventually gets checked against results. The midterms and the next presidential cycle are going to be the actual proving ground for every version of this disagreement. Whether the party's specific policy platform, stripped of the cultural signaling Maher keeps flagging, can win back the coalition it's lost, or whether the substance itself has drifted as far from the median voter as the symbolism has. Until those results are in, this remains an open, genuinely contested argument inside a party that spent over a year hearing roughly the same critique from the same source, in a dozen different forms, without ever fully settling on whether to take it seriously. It's worth stepping back to notice how unusual it actually is for a commentator to sustain a single argument this consistently for this long, rather than chasing whatever controversy happens to be trending in a given week. Most political commentary, across every outlet and every political persuasion, tends to be reactive, respond to the news cycle, generate a take, move on to the next story. What's different about this particular year-long thread of Maher's commentary is the consistency of the underlying diagnosis across wildly different specific events: an election night monologue, an awards show ritual, a state legislator's holiday comment, a business metaphor, and a congressional pledge vote are 5 almost entirely unrelated news stories, connected by nothing except Maher's insistence on reading each one through the same lens. That kind of sustained argument is either evidence of real conviction about an actual pattern, or evidence of a commentator who's found one profitable narrative and is determined to fit every news story into it, regardless of fit. Reasonable people can disagree about which of those two explanations is more accurate, but the sheer volume and consistency of examples makes the first explanation considerably harder to dismiss than it might be if this were just 1 or 2 isolated incidents. There's also something worth noting about the specific role Maher has carved out within his own party's media ecosystem by taking this approach, because it's genuinely rare. Most opinion hosts build and maintain their audience by reliably telling that audience what it already wants to hear. That's simply the dominant business model of modern political commentary, on every network and every platform. Maher's entire approach across this stretch of segments runs against that model. He's spent over a year risking exactly the kind of audience backlash that comes from repeatedly telling a left-leaning viewership things it visibly doesn't want to hear, over and over, without ever fully pivoting back to safer, more crowd-pleasing material, whether that's principled independence or simply a different, contrarian business model built around generating controversy from within rather than outrage from without is a fair question. But it's worth noting that the format itself, a genuinely mixed audience show with guests from across the spectrum rather than a single-party echo chamber, is part of what makes this particular kind of sustained internal critique possible in the first place. It's much harder to deliver this message consistently on a show built entirely around reinforcing one side's existing assumptions. If you like this breakdown, make sure to like the video and subscribe so you catch the next one.